Welcome back to my series on chess opening theory. In this video, I'm going to be doing an introduction to the advanced variation of the French defense. So the French defense begins after the moves e4, e6, d4, d5, and the advanced variation is when white now plays the move pawn to e5. And already, we see some ideas from white. By playing the move pawn to e5, white takes control of the f6 square, preventing black's knight from developing there. And it also makes it more difficult for black to develop their light square bishop, as the pawn is now in the way of this pawn, so this bishop has difficulty getting out. So generally, the way that black responds to this is with the move pawn to c5, challenging white in the center and basically trying to argue that the pawn on e5 is as much a weakness as it is a strength. And basically, black tries to get rid of the pawn on d4 because ideally black wants to be attacking the pawn on e5 with their pieces, and it's much harder to attack something with pieces when it is defended by a pawn. So in this game, with the white pieces, we have Grandmaster Ervin Lamy, who is an opening theorist and also one of the seconds for Grandmaster Anish Giri. And that is really saying something because Grandmaster Giri is very well known as a super Grandmaster with extraordinarily good prep. So Grandmaster Lamy is one of the people who helps make that magic happen. But he's also a strong player in his own right, and he has done a number of courses on Chessable, including a very good one on the Caro-Kann. And with the black pieces, we have Grandmaster Alexei Shirov. And, oh my, there are quite a few great things that I can say about Shirov. Where to begin? He's a former number 2 in the world, and he earned the right to challenge Garry Kasparov for his world championship title. Although sadly, that match never came to be. But aside from that, he's very well known for his very fun attacking style, being seen as sort of a spiritual successor to Mikhail Tal, although a little bit less dubious. And he's also very well known for precise play in the endgame. So if you want to study the games of Shirov, I would recommend checking out his book called Fire on Board, which is a collection of his best games. And the most important thing for us, of course, is that Grandmaster Shirov is one of the great masters of the French defense. So when learning the French, it is very hard to go wrong with looking at a game by Shirov. And this game was played in the FIDE Grand Swiss 2019. So it was a fairly recent game. And more information about the players and the tournament can be found in the video description. So back to the game. So in this position, white does not want to lose the pawn on d4. White wants to keep a pawn there. So white plays the move pawn to c3, basically saying, aha, if you take my pawn on d4, I will just replace it with another pawn. So then black continues by developing their pieces, developing their queenside knight, putting some more pressure on the d4 and e5 square. And white, in turn, counters this by developing their kingside knight, defending these two squares. And so in this position, black played, the most common move, which is move queen to b6. And this move applies some more pressure to the d4 square, but it also applies some pressure to the b2 pawn as well, thus making it a bit more difficult for white to get their pieces out, like their pieces on the queen side in particular, as the bishop on c1 is now kind of tied down to defending this pawn, and it's actually very tricky to get this knight out as well, as if it goes to a3, then black will just take on d4 and then trade their bishop for the knight on a3 and ruin white's pawn structure. And if the knight would go to d2, then black would take the pawn on d4 and most likely win it. So in this position, there are 3 main moves for white. We have reached an important tabia in the advanced variation. Those moves are pawn to a3, that is the most common move, and will probably get a video of its own as the a3 c4 middle game is very interesting. The move bishop to e2 is the second most common move and is the one we'll be looking at in this video. And the other most common move is bishop to d3, which is a bit of a dubious gambit, but it's important to know about the little traps and tricks that are present in there. So that will also probably get a video. So in this game, white played the move bishop to e2, with a very simple idea, just to castle kingside, right, and develop a piece. And in this position, it's actually very important that black now take on d4. I will reveal the reason in a little bit, like about a move from now. But the way that I like to remember it is basically as soon as white is able to castle kingside, right, if white were to play d takes c5, normally that move would be very problematic because not only does it remove the d4 pawn from defending the pawn on e5, but it would also allow black to play bishop takes c5, and black would be attacking the pawn on f2, which would be difficult to defend. However, if white is now able to castle kingside, then castling kingside would actually be a very convenient way to defend that pawn, and the bishop would be somewhat misplaced on c5. So that's how I generally remember to take right now. Basically, to consider what would happen if white did in fact play d takes c5 and black responds with bishop takes c5. But of course, that's not the real reason, but that's how I like to remember it. So white took back with the pawn because white wants to keep a pawn defending the pawn on e5. And in this position, there are 2 main moves for black. They both kind of have the same idea. So the move that I prefer is the one that was played in the game. That is the move knight to h6. And the other move for black is the move knight g e7. And the reason why I personally don't like this move, and I think a number of other French players don't like this move as well, is just that it allows white to play the maneuver knight a3, knight c2, which would just be an excellent place for that knight. So for example, if black played the alternative move knight g e7, that blocks the bishop on f8, so white would now play knight to a3, and then after knight to f5, which is the idea of either of these knight moves, white would now just play knight to c2, defending the d4 pawn, but also taking a look at some other squares, namely the b4 square, or maybe eventually maneuvering to e3. Stuff like that. Like, this is just a great place for white's queenside knight, right? And normally the queenside knight is a bit of a problem piece for white, so it doesn't really make sense to help white solve their problems. However, there is one downside to this move, knight to h6, and that downside is that white can go for this very dynamic line, bishop takes h6, and here it is important for black to remember not to take the bishop back right away and just end up with a bad pawn structure over here, but to instead first grab some compensation for the bad pawn structure with the move queen takes b2. And this position is very messy and very double-edged, but objectively it's about equal, but it's the fun kind of equal. It's dynamically equal, which means that each side has about equal winning chances, and that generally the better player will win the game. So I will now reveal the reason why taking on d4 with the pawn was important. If we go back and pretend that black did not take the pawn on d4, did not play c takes d4, and instead just played knight h6 right away, then when white plays bishop takes h6, if black now plays queen takes b2, then white will have this nasty option of playing bishop to e3. And if black now plays queen takes a1, then white will have some nasty ideas to trap the queen by playing queen to c2. And it's a little bit more complicated than that. I have some additional notes about this position in the Lichess study where I have where I've covered this game. So links to that in the video description as well. Like one interesting little detail is that if black now takes here, it's actually correct for white to take back with the knight. Right? It's like that's one important thing to remember, as there's some interesting stuff where, like, if black tries playing bishop a3 to get the queen out on b2, basically white could counter with knight b5. And if black does go for this trade and then tries this, then, you know, white has some interesting ideas with bishop b5, and black has to either expose their king with bishop to d7, and that's generally not fun, or black has to play like king f8, which can also get not fun. So more details about the exact intricacies in the Lichess study. I think I've said enough about this. If we go back to the move knight h6 with c takes d4, c takes d4 included. After bishop takes h6, queen takes b2, if white were to now try the move bishop to e3, then this will not actually work, because black will just have the move knight to b4, hitting the queen, and the black queen will just get out by just taking on a2. And white has to watch out for the fact that the knight on b1 is pinned and is a bit vulnerable. So if white, for example, played queen a4 check, this would be quite a mistake, because black just blocks, and now the queen and knights would be under attack. But this is not what happened in the game. It's just important to know about this if you're going to play knight h6. So what instead happened in the game is white just developed their queenside knight, kind of realizing that you know, it can't really go to a3, and going to d2 is not so great. And in this position, black played the move that was the point of knight h6, which is just to bring the knight to f5 and attack the pawn. Another thing I like about knight h6 is just that it prevents white from preemptively playing g4 to stop the knight f5 move. But anyway, in this position, there isn't really a nice way for whites to defend the pawn on d4. Like, white could try some stuff with bishop to e3, but black could play queen takes b2, and already this is very unpleasant, just because the knight on c3 is under attack, so white does not really have time to counter attack the queen. White has to do something about this guy, and the position does get a bit messy. Like, there might be some interesting stuff after knight b5, but objectively this is better for black. But this is not what happened in the game. Instead, white protected this pawn indirectly by playing the move bishop to b5. This was probably part of the point of playing knight to c3, as the knight on c3 supports the bishop on b5, which now pins the black knight to the king. And in this position, black renewed the threat on the d4 pawn by playing bishop to d7, essentially forcing white's hand, forcing white to take on c6, otherwise the pawn on d4 would be lost. And here in this position, there are, like, according to the engine, any recapture is good, but black went for the most common recapture, which is just to take back with the bishop. And now white castled their king, and black developed their final piece. And in this position, white played a move that is very commonly played at top level, and is the engine's preference, but it's actually a pretty mysterious move, and that is the move pawn to a4. Like the book where I originally saw this game, which is the book The French Defense Move by Move by Grandmaster Damian Lemos. In that book, Grandmaster Lemos himself says, yeah, I'm not fully sure what the ideas behind pawn to a4 are. But if I personally had to guess, it's like this is me talking, not Grandmaster Lemos. So if I had to guess, I would say that the idea is probably to control the b5 square, because black's light square bishop is a bit of a problem piece, and in theory it might have been able to go to b5 and then maybe to c4 or d3 at some point and maybe participate in black's plan that way. So that is my guess as to why the engine and why the top level players like the move pawn to a4. So we are now kind of out of the opening, like both sides have more or less developed their pieces. So if you've been able to understand all the moves this far, or you're doing very well. Like if you play like this and you lose, then it will not be because of the opening. And so anyway, black now played the move castle's kingside, and the engine considers this an inaccuracy, but it's actually very unclear why this is inaccurate, as the engine prefers first playing rook to c8, but that still kind of allows the same idea that white could go for in this position, which is to now play the move pawn to g4, and then after knight to e7, white could play knight to a2, and there isn't really a nice square for black to be putting this bishop. Like if black tries putting the bishop on a5, then the problem with that is that white could potentially prepare to play the move pawn to b4 at some point and just have some nasty tempo and a nasty initiative on the queen side. Right, so black will most likely have to give up their good bishop for this knight. Right, and that's probably what the engine likes about this, but rook c8 kind of allows the same thing, so it's kind of a mystery as to why castling is bad in this case. Like maybe white's kingside attack is more likely to succeed. I'm not fully sure, but that's not what happened in the game. Instead, in this position, white played the move knight to e2. And this move does have some logic behind it. Basically, just trying to maneuver this knight over to the king side where white is strongest and where white might be able to launch an attack. In this position, black made the move queen to a5, which is a move that I quite like. The idea being that black is now going to move the queen out of the way to play b5, and if black had a free move, like if black could move again, they would immediately play b5, and white would not be able to play a takes b5 because the rook on a1 is not defended. So white addressed this problem with the move bishop to f4, developing their bishop and also defending their rook. And black plays the move pawn to b5 anyway. White takes, and black takes back with the queen as it was now under attack. And in this position, this is where white starts to go a bit wrong, in my opinion. White played the move knight to g3, and the reason why I personally don't like the move knight g3 is because it gets in the way of the g-pawn. In my opinion, white should have, and also the engine's opinion, white should have played the move pawn to g4 first, as g3 is a great 8 square for white's knight. Right, and it just makes sense to basically white wants to play on the king side, white wants to launch some kind of attack over here, and it's generally very difficult to attack the opponent when their pawns are all together like this, as there aren't any real weaknesses. You want to try to induce some kind of weakness, as that will make attacking much more easier, as you can maybe get some sacrifice going on, like maybe sack on h6, or if the g pawn comes forward, then that would weaken the h6 and f6 squares. So generally, one way to induce a weakness is to use your own pawns, like just send your own pawns down the board, like provoke the pawn, like one of these pawns forward. And so that's why, in my opinion, knight g3 is where white starts to go wrong, as this knight is in the way of the g-pawn, and white will most likely have to move this knight again if they want to actually get on with their kingside attack. So in this position, black also made a bit of an inaccuracy, but I would say this inaccuracy is fairly minor. The engine prefers the move bishop to d7, which I do agree with being a bit better, as if white does play the move knight takes f5, which would kind of justify white putting the knight on g3, then black could take back with the pawn, and the pawn would be defended, and then black would be able to just put their bishop on e6 and just kind of use the bishop defensively to just hold everything together. And not only that, but by playing bishop to d7, the bishop would be getting out of the way of black's other pieces, in particular the rook, which most likely wants to grab the c-file. Well, so that's why the move pawn to a5 is a bit inaccurate, but it's only, like, it's very minorly inaccurate in my opinion. So in this position, white played the move knight to h5, which I think is a little bit silly, as taking on f5 would have at least justified putting the knight on g3. But anyway, in this position, black puts their rook on c8, as rooks belong on open files. White played pawn to g4, black played knight to e7, and here white played the move bishop to d2, which is not a move that I like very much, as if white is indeed trying to attack on the king side, then it does not really make sense to trade one of your potential attacking pieces, this bishop, for a piece that isn't really participating in black's defense, like isn't really participating in the defense of black's king side. So that's why I don't like this move very much. Like, there is some logic to it. Like, black does have the bishop pair, and it can make sense to trade away one of the bishops just to weaken the bishop pair. But I still don't like this idea. Yeah, as it makes white's kingside attack less possible. Like, I kind of see this move as essentially white giving up on their kingside play. So another possible idea of the move bishop to d2 is just to free up the f4 square for the knight on h5. So to counter that, black plays the move knight to g6, improving the position of their own knight and potentially getting ready to trade on f4 if white tries the move knight to f4. And here, white plays the move bishop takes b4. And part of the reason why this is inaccurate is because when black recaptures on b4, black greatly improves the position of their queen. Their queen now eyes these two weaknesses, the isolated b-pawn as well as the backward d-pawn. But not only that, but there is a third weakness that the queen is potentially eyeing. And so in this position, white plays the move queen to d2. And if you want, you can now pause the video and see if you can find a little tactic that black now played that won a little bit of material. So I will reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. The move that black played is knight takes e5. And part of the idea of this is just that white's knight and pawns are kind of overloaded. Like, the knight in particular can't both take the knight on e5 and defend the queen on d2. And the problem with taking this knight with the pawn is that it allows black to take the mysterious third weakness, which was the pawn on g4, and white should now block with knight g3, as that otherwise king h1 would lose both knights. And then when black takes on f3, not only does black have this nice protected pass pawn, but this diagonal is potentially very dangerous if black is ever able to get it open. And so this position just looks very unpleasant for white. So white did not go for this. Instead, back in this position, white played the move queen takes b4, and now a very important intermezzo by black, which is to play knight takes f3 check. White's king comes forward because otherwise white would have just lost a knight. And black really wants to make the king work for it. You know, that king, he's just been sitting on the couch eating potato chips all day, watching too much television. So black really makes the king work for it, making the king come out and actually kind of misplacing the king when he does take on h4. And so black takes the queen, white takes the knight, and now black trades into an endgame. And notice that even though the white king is out, it actually is kind of misplaced, as it being over here does leave these pawns on the second rank a bit vulnerable. So black now plays the move bishop to e8. And if I were playing this game, I would probably go for putting the rook on the 7th rank and, you know, just going after these pawns. But black went about this endgame in a slightly different way. Another important thing about bishop e8, aside from getting out of the rook's way, is that it also prevents any nasty back rank mate ideas, as king f8 would protect the bishop and all that stuff. So in this position, white played king to g3, and instead of playing rook to c2, black instead chose to play rook to c4, going after the center pawn instead. White plays the move rook to a8, which I agree with. I do like this move, as generally in the endgame, like especially endgames with rooks, piece activity is often just as important as material. Like if you just defend your pawns passively, then eventually your opponent will put so much pressure on you that so much pressure on your weaknesses that eventually something's going to give and you'll end up losing. So it's often better to counterattack and try to trade pawns as opposed to defend your pawns, as when you're losing, trading pawns is good, as it's much harder for your opponent to promote a pawn if there are less pawns on the board. Similarly, it's also a lot easier to defend against your opponent promoting a pawn if there are less pawns. So anyway, black played the only logical move here, which is to defend the bishop. And here, white could have gone for the move knight takes g7, which would win a pawn, but the problem is that it would trade away some pieces and simplify the position into an endgame that is just completely lost for white. Right, as basically black's rook in particular is better placed, and black would probably be able to win this endgame blindfolded. So generally speaking, you don't want to trade pieces when you're losing, as that will generally simplify the position. And also, if your opponent is up a piece, then their extra piece will be more and more felt as more pieces come off the board. So white did not go for the knight takes g7 idea. Instead, in this position, white played the move f3, which I do think is a sensible move, as after the move rook takes d4, which is now played in the game, it does defend the pawn on g4. And here white plays the move rook b8, keeping an eye on the b4 pawn, trying to tie up this rook. But a problem, of course, is that the b pawn is not the only important pawn that white needs to worry about. Black plays the move rook c4 to get out of the way of the d pawn. And here, white plays the move pawn to g5, which I don't really like very much. I think that the knight on h5 is somewhat misplaced. Eastend, should have come back to f4. Like, there is some logic to keeping it here, as it does sort of stop the king from coming to e7. But I kind of feel that the pawn on d, like the past d pawn, is much more urgent and needs to be dealt with. So that's why I personally prefer the move knight f4 over pawn to g5. But anyway, white played pawn to g5. Black played pawn to d4. And here, white played the move pawn to h4, or again, not playing knight to f4. Or like, I do understand that white might be trying to push these pawns and trade some of them on the king side. But this is just a bit too slow. Oh, and the d pawn is very, very dangerous. So black plays the move pawn to d3. White now plays the move rook to d8. And here black plays a very cool move. If you want, you can pause the video, see if you can find the cool little move that black now plays. It's not something that necessarily wins material, at least not immediately. There's some nuance to it later on. But I will now reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. And so the move was pawn to e5. The idea being that not only does it potentially like allow black to play rook to d4, but it also controls the f4 square, making it impossible for this knight to come back to f4. And another important thing about that is that if white now played the move rook takes d3, then black would have the move pawn to f5, attacking the knight on h5. And if white tries to pin the bishop, preventing the loss of the knight, then I think it's important to throw in this important move, just throwing the pawn forward, as after black plays king to e7, hitting the rook and freeing up the bishop, black could potentially, like basically, after white moves their king somewhere, such as on g4, and black plays this, in my opinion, white's best option is to sacrifice the exchange as opposed to just going down an entire piece. And basically, since the pawn was pushed to f4, this knight capture over here, like knight takes g7 check, would no longer be forking the king and pawn. Although an important thing about this endgame, of course, is that the king and knight are too far away from the b pawn over here. So black doesn't even necessarily need to worry about keeping all their kingside pawns. Black can just go win this pawn and then push this pawn up the board. And even if white were to manage to get their knight over to stop promotion, white would most likely have to give up their knight for the pawn. And black doesn't need any extra pawns when they're up a rook. Like, black can just checkmate with king and rook. Okay, so anyway, that's not what happened in the game. I just thought it was important to point that out, why white didn't now play rook takes d3. Instead, white played the move b3, trying to just kick this rook away, because if the rook is kicked away, maybe, something can happen. But black just plays rook d4, being like, no, I planned this all along. This was the true point of pawn to e5. And so, right at this rook trade, basically, probably right at the point where black played e5, in fact, black had schemed a cool little move here. So white plays king f2, and if you want, you can pause the video and see if you can find sort of the killing blow, sort of black's next move, which is a very cool little idea. Yeah. So I will now reveal the move in 3, 2, 1. And so the move was bishop to a4, a very cool idea, which is that white cannot take this bishop, because otherwise the b pawn is just unstoppable. White's pieces simply will not arrive in time, like after pawn takes, b3, knight comes here, b2, white would just not be in time to stop the pawn. So as a result, white has to lose the pawn on b3. And in this position, black plays the move pawn to d2, essentially forcing white's next move, which is king to e2. And black now plays bishop takes b3, forcing white's next move as black now threatens to promote. So white plays king takes d2. And now the final move of the game is bishop to c4. And it was in this position that white resigned, as basically white's king and can't really get close to these pawns. And also the bishop is doing a good job of cutting off the knight as well. Like, it's actually going to take the knight quite a while in order to get at these pawns. And so black is just going to have time to bring their king and win this endgame. And for example, if white tries coming in like this, then this king and pawn endgame would actually be completely lost, because after pawn to b3, white would not be able to take this pawn, as this pawn would just run up and promote. So that is why white resigned. Basically, black is going to have time to bring their king into the endgame and be able to win this endgame up 2 pawns. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed the video. If you did, feel free to like, comment, subscribe. And that's all for now. Until next time.